Today's agenda is the security assessment and testing domain, which is domain 6 of CISSP test. We have briefly discussed that there are 8 domains in CISSP, out of which 100 to 150 questions will be asked in the test. So in the CISSP, you'll be faced with 8 domains. There are 8 domains in the test. There'll be 100 to 150 questions, and there'll be 3 hours for you to figure out all those questions. You have to obtain minimum 70% out of the 1,000 numbers. You have to score 700 plus. And the one good thing about CISSP test is if within 100 questions you score more than 70%, and since it is a CAT test, computer-aided test, so basically the difficulty of the test, difficulty of the subsequent questions for every right question will keep on increasing, and for every wrong question, the subsequent question will be easier for you. So if you manage to get 70% plus score in first 100 questions, then you won't need to solve any further questions, and you'll pass your test and you'll be certified eventually, given that you have the right experience for the test, for the certification. Cool. Now moving on to the basics of it, we have talked about CI triad, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which is a basic theme of entire info security field of operations. So that is something which will remain with you throughout your career. And then we talked about frameworks, how frameworks help you to bring order to the chaos, thought things out clearly before you implement anything in your environment, and how it gives you a fundamental building blocks on top of which you can add your enterprise security, with which you can integrate your business requirements with your controls or whatever information security efforts that you're going to put in your environment. Then we talked about risk management frameworks. We talked about risk assessment and analysis. We talked about risk treatment plan, and we talked about residual risk, how to do the cost benefit analysis, how to do qualitative and quantitative risk assessment and whatnot, so that whatever control you choose to put are cost effective. And how do we do it is, I'll give you the question. You will have 10 seconds to punch in your answers in a chat box. You just need to give me the right option, say A, B, C, D, whatever. And based on that, if there is a unanimous agreement on some option, then we won't discuss that question. If there is a confusion or conflict in the answer, say 5 people say that A is correct, other 5 say that B is correct or something else is correct, then we'll take that question up, we discuss that question, and we figure out as to why a certain option is correct or a certain option is incorrect. Okay. So going to your first question, just give me a second and put in this stopwatch on. Okay. Which of the following is not true to OpenID Connect? It's mainly used as an open standards-based single sign-on mechanism between disparate platforms within an enterprise environment. It is layered on OAuth protocol to allow both authentication and authorization in a transparent way for client resource requests. It supports authorization code, implicit and hybrid flows. It involves browser redirections from OpenID providers back to the relaying party using authorization codes. Generally, how we implement SSO in this kind of setup, what we are talking about here is single sign-on mechanism between disparate platforms within an enterprise environment. So what OpenID Connect is, it is basically an identity provider for OAuth. So wherever we implement this, we implement both in order to achieve SSO. So that is why it is not this. It is rest of the options are true for rest of the statements are true for OpenID Connect, but OpenID Connect is an identity provider for SSO. So we can discuss it at the end of the session. So OpenID Connect basically is an identity provider, and it is not a stack of standards. It is not a stack of standards. It is basically an identity provider for OAuth. So whenever we are implementing SSO based on open standards, we use both OpenID Connect as well as OAuth in order to achieve SSO. So it is not a SSO for that matter. That is why this is not true for this particular for OpenID Connect. Okay. This second, moving on to the second question. Whatever these options are there, which are stated here, one of these is a set of extensions to DNS that provides to DNS clients origin authentication of DNS data to reduce the threat of DNS poisoning, spoofing, and similar attack types. The time starts now. You have 10 seconds to continue your answers. Okay. Your time's up. So input is B. What B is? B is zone transfer. So if you know that, if you have read about DNS, what DNS is. So DNS DNS query is generally responded on. So if there is a DNS server, this is my server, this is my DNS client. Okay. Now, when a client will communicate with DNS server, it will initiate a query on port 53 that will be on UDP. Okay. What zone transfer is? In zone transfer, you have, so you do not have one single DNS server. You have multiple of DNS servers and one DNS server where you can modify the DNS record for particular A record or for A record. That is this for IPv6 and this for IPv4. Okay. The one on which you can write or modify the records is your authoritative DNS, and rest of the DNS servers talk to this authoritative DNS server if they fail to have any record pertaining to whatever user has requested. So this is my DNS server, say 8.8.8.8 is Google's public DNS server. My client has requested on UDP port 53 that, hey, what is google.com? Okay. If this guy doesn't have this, then it will go to one level above it, or then one level above it if this one also doesn't have that. What zone transfer is the communication between the servers. Say, for example, I've created a zone called google.com. When zone transfer happens, all the subdomains within google.com will be replicated to the one server below it from this authoritative DNS server. And zone transfer generally happens on TCP 53. Okay, so that is the basic distinction between zone transfer and a regular DNS query. Zone transfer is basically between server and server, between two servers, and a DNS query runs between a client and a server. What this question is asking for is the set of extensions which provide DNS clients with origin authentication of DNS data to reduce the threat of DNS poisoning. Origin authentication, which is in DNSSEC. It is an extension of original DNS implementation. So option C is correct. I've told you what zone transfer is. Resource transfer, I don't think is a valid term. Same as the resource records. Moving on to the next question, which is, which of the following is a common association with Clark-Wilson access model? Your time starts now. You have 10 seconds. So you can punch in your answers in the chat window. And your time is up. So if you remember in Clark-Wilson model, what we talked about is, here is your user in Clark-Wilson. Again, there is a, yeah, cool. A few answers are correct. Okay. Here is your constrained data, is unconstrained data, and here is your transformation process, TP, and here is your object, which the user is trying to access. This is your subject. When you're accessing unconstrained data, you go through here. When you're accessing constrained data, you go through a transformation process. So there are well-formed transactions in this case, okay? Because there is a transformation process through which only you can interact with constrained data, okay? That is why in Clark-Wilson model, you see well-formed transactions. Moving on to the fourth question. Option D is correct. Moving on to the fourth question. Which of the following means of data removal makes the data unrecoverable, even with extraordinary efforts such as with physical forensics in a laboratory? Time starts now. Okay, time's up. So what we are talking about here is we are talking to make the data unrecoverable. Deletion of data, it is unsafe because in deletion, what you do is your file system basically removes the entry of that file name corresponding to the sector storage memory address where it is located. So your data still is there, only the entry pertaining to the file name is removed. So deletion is not the case. Elimination, we are using elimination here. Then sanitization generally is done to reuse the media, so that is also not the case. So purging seems like the right option in here. So option C is correct. Moving on to the fifth question. Steve, a department manager, has been asked to join a committee that is responsible for defining an acceptable level of risk for the organization, reviewing risk assessment and audit reports, and approving significant changes to security policies and programs. What committee is he joining? The time starts now. Your time is up. I see there is a divide. So we discussed it. We talked about too many things here. Here's your risk of the organization, reviewing your policies and programs. Your risk assessment and audit reports, approving significant oversight of kind of committee, like it is sitting on top, and then there'll be subcommittees within it. So there may be a risk management committee, there'll be a DR committee or something like that. So it is a oversight kind of committee in which he is participating because he is doing multiple things. If you have any doubts, any questions, you pin it, you save it, you note it down. We can come back to these slides and after the end of the session, we can come back to any of the slides that you want me to come back to. Okay, so hold your thoughts as of now. So it is this guy is Steve is joining an oversight kind of committee, which is mostly this because audit committee is specific to audit, security policy committee is specific to drafting policies, modification of it. Risk management committee is specific to your risk assessment, your acceptable level of risk, etc. Okay, but he's doing just too many things. So security steering committee seems like the correct option. That is the correct option here. Okay, coming to the agenda of today. Security assessment and testing. So how does it link with why do we need to do the assessment or testing? Why do we do that? Okay, we do that because since the beginning we've been talking about what is the risk appetite of an organization. Based on the risk appetite of the organization, we try to assess what are the inherent risks. There's whatever you do, there'll be some inherent risk, and there'll be your appetite, risk appetite. There'll be some inherent risk in whatever you do, and then you put controls to reduce the risk within the appetite. Okay, so your risk appetite, organization's risk appetite, drives your risk treatment efforts. Now you have documented everything. You have figured out a framework. You have figured out a policy. You have chalked out all the procedures. You have done too many tabletop exercises. You have a BCTD in place. You have a DR in place, and so on and so forth. Whatever you have done, just too many things. Okay, everything is documented. Everything is in place. But how to ensure that all the changes which are needed to be done in your environment are there. And as you must also be aware that change is a constant thing in the world that we day and age that we live in. So what if something has changed and whatever you had documented before may not be fully applicable to the new change, or while changing something, a few things might be skipped. So now, since the controls are not effectively put in the environment, maybe your risk is now greater than your risk appetite. So how do you figure that out? That is what the purpose of testing, etc. is. Okay, that is why we do testing and we do assessment, because we wish to understand that whatever business requirements that we started with are met by the end of it. This is where we started, this is where we ended, and this is the time period between the two. So we do assessment just to ensure that whatever we started with is met here by the end of it, because not every any project will take some time to get implemented, and within that time maybe a few things might have changed. Maybe your HLD high level diagram or LLD low level diagram has changed, or maybe your organization's requirement has changed altogether. Maybe you were implementing something on-prem and now your organization wants to go to cloud tomorrow. So things have changed. So that is why you do assessment and we do testing just to ensure that everything is working as documented or as planned. Okay, so that is what the purpose of a test, the purpose of testing the system is. Now there are two things that are widely used while talking about testing a system. What are those things? One is verification and other is validation. So what validation basically means that our organization requires, as I've told you, that there's certain risk appetite of the organization, okay, and there is which will drive the risk treatment plan of the organization. Accordingly, organization will see what risk to mitigate and to what extent shall they mitigate it to bring the inherent risk back to risk appetite of the organization. Okay, that is your residual risk. The residual risk must be equal to the risk appetite of the organization. That is what is the motive of putting any controls, all this planning, all this architecture is because of this. Okay. So validation basically tells me that whatever controls we have put, whatever efforts that we have put in security, whatever commitments that we have made for security are in line with your business objectives. Because at the end of the day, business is not running for security. Security is running for business. So security must enable business, and that is what validation means. That my controls, my efforts are in line with the business requirement. Okay. What verification means is, so say we have drafted a policy document that every endpoint must have AV and ADR in place. Okay. Now you have started, you set up the servers in central location maybe, and then you have different branches where your endpoints are located, or maybe some remote endpoints are located on the internet. Now you started pushing this AV EDR agent on all these machines. How do you ensure that? In the policy you have stated that 99% of the endpoints must have your AV installed, and that is my KPI, key performance indicator. Okay, so what verification does is, verification tells me whether whatever I have implemented is in line with whatever I have documented. Okay, so verification is what I implement is implemented correctly, and validation is whatever I'm implementing is in line with the business requirement of the organization. So if I'm building the right product or not, if I'm building the right security architecture or not. That is what validation is. Verification is whether I've built it right. Now, testing a system, I've told you, we can say again, coming to AV itself. Say you have a central policy manager, you have a policy server, which is located in your central location. Then you have a branch here, then you have a remote, some roaming users here. Then you have another branch in a remote location, which is running on a VSAT. Okay. Then you have some other branch and you have multitude of environment. Maybe you are having some cloud instance, which is your VDI, virtual desktop, something like that. Okay. So that is how this AV deployment will look like finally in an organization, in a real organization. Okay. Now, how do I test that it is working effectively or as planned? So there can be multitude of tests that I can run on the environment, and that is unit tests, interface tests, and system tests. Unit tests, I carve out all the boundaries here. So whenever my network, say I take network as a boundary parameter. So whenever my network changes, my boundary changes. So within one boundary, you have one unit, because we have taken network segment as our boundary condition. So within one network boundary, you have one unit, and you isolate this one unit and test it out for accepted behavior. Say, whenever there is a malware in the machine, it shall trigger an alert, and it shall also raise a ticket in your whatever integration that you have done in the SIEM or whatever ticketing tool that you may be having. Okay. So we isolate this particular management console, and we use one single machine which is connected directly to it, and we maybe put a sample malware code here, and we see whether AV is throwing alerts or not. And that is my unit testing. I isolate one unit of the entire system, and I test it for the efficacy of it or the intended behavior of it. Okay. Then my interface testing. So when I'm going from this central location to my VSAT branch, which is a bandwidth limited and latency is very high in VSAT network. So there's an interface in between because the segment has changed now. These are two different segments which are connected with this VSAT link, which is here. So I'll see that whether my behavior changes across this interface or not. And that is my interface testing. I'll put a agent here again, put a sample malware here, and see whether the alert is thrown on the central console or not. Then the system test. Once I've done the unit test and the interface test, I can test the entire system, which is this whole thing. Okay. So those are the tests that we can perform in an environment. It can be unit test, it can be interface test, or it can be a test for entire system, functionality of entire system. Okay. I hope I'm clear so far. If you have any doubts, you pin it. We'll discuss it by the end of the session. Now, coming to testing techniques, there can be multitude of techniques. Depending upon the efforts, it can be automated or manual. Say you're running a VA scan every quarter, and that is automated through, say, we used to use Qualys Guard scanner. So it is, you have put a policy and it all automatically every quarter triggers it at a certain time and scans your assets for the known vulnerabilities which are there in the Qualys database and gives you a report. That is an automated testing. In manual testing, say you're conducting a PT, penetration testing. So you know the vulnerabilities. You have enumerated the vulnerabilities in your environment, and now you try to actually exploit it as a attacker would. So that is more of a manual approach. So techniques can be based on effort, either manual or automated. Mostly you'll see a hybrid of these two. So there'll be some tests which are running manually. There'll be some tests which are running of two types, static and dynamic. What static means is basically your static code analysis. You have a program, you have the source code of it. You run a static code examiner and it will tell you whether the best practices are followed or not, whether there is a logic which is missing or which is incorrectly placed in the code, and it will give you a verdict. So static is basically code is not running, it is not in runtime, it is not executed, and the code itself is reviewed. In dynamic, your application is actually executing and the system will check the behavior in real time, in runtime during execution. So that is your dynamic testing. Then there can be another thing which is called fuzz. In fuzz, in dynamic, you basically give the good input. You must be knowing that garbage in, garbage out. So it can mean good in, good out, or garbage in, garbage out. Okay. So in dynamic testing, what you do is you know the known inputs that it takes, the application takes, and you know the expected output for that known input. So say for input one, it gives output one, and you have validated that in dynamic testing. Now what do we do in fuzz? We input random data in the application and we see the output of it, whether it is still the logic is working as expected or not. That is your fuzz testing. That is where good input GIGO comes in, good in, good out, or garbage in, garbage out. That was your runtime testing. Now, during this dynamic testing, one can be given complete. Now, during these testings, one can be given the full unfettered access to the source code, and that will be your white box. Or one cannot be given access to the source code, that will be your black box. During testing, if the tester knows about the source code, it will be called white box. And if the tester doesn't know about the source code, it will be called a black box condition. Then you have based on use case, you can have positive, negative, or misuse case. What else is there? So these are your testing techniques. It can be automated, manual, based on runtime. It can be static or dynamic. And then within dynamic, you have fuzz also, in which you input random thing. Based on the access to the code, you can have either black or white box condition, in which you test the application. Then you have positive, negative, and misuse case testing. So what positive and negative basically are? Your positive means that application is working as expected. Negative means that if I input something malicious, it shall fail gracefully at least, or it shall throw an error without giving much information out. And then you have your operational testing, which can be of two types. Either you monitor real user, so which is called real user monitoring, and or you do synthetic input, synthetic performance monitoring. So in case of real user input, we deploy the application in some user's machine, and then we take, then we observe it, whatever user is inputting, whatever output it is throwing. This can be limited to the extent which user is using the application for. So real user testing requires some time. It will give you a real user behavior, but it requires time because you are supposed to deploy it in the real environment, your production environment, where there are actually users using the application. And it also gives you a limited set of data to work with, because user will be interacting with the application in a logical manner, like whatever do they need to perform. For example, we take the case of AV. User will, at max, what will they do? They'll try to update the definition, maybe update the policies, check the quarantine folder, check what is blocked, what is not, and stuff like that. And AV may be offering many more features than that. So that may be left out because user is not having the fullest idea of the application. That is where the synthetic performance testing comes in. So synthetic performance testing, basically you run a batch script or you automate the process. You use the computer, you make the computer perform the tests on the application itself, on the efficacy of the application. You put in some logic, maybe some script, and based on that, you assess the performance of the application. That is what synthetic performance monitoring is. Now coming to regression testing. So what regression is, you have deployed AV version 1.0 in your environment. Okay, now another version is released, 1.1. There may be some changes in the new version. And when you do the testing of this new version is what is called regression testing. Testing the modified or next iteration of any application is regression testing. Now coming to your testers and assessors. Testers and assessors can be of multitude of types. These can be internal, external. This is your end, this is your X, and this is your third party. Okay, what is the difference? This is my organization. Okay, I may be having my internal team, which is responsible for testing of the application. So that is my internal. I may be providing some services to a second party. If that party asks for testing your application, that will be external. Or maybe some other independent auditor which wants to perform an audit. That is your external. Either the organization you're providing services to, or any independent auditor or tester which wants to perform audit on your application. Where does third party come in? Third party comes in when there is a contract between the two, and this external party appoints somebody to do an assessment on your application. So this in third party, this is how the flow looks like. This whatever organization you provide your services to will appoint somebody to do a audit or testing of your application, and that is how third party is chalked out. Now coming to SOC reports, which is Service Organization Controls report. SOC reports can be of three types. There are 1, 2, 3. SOC 1 is financial in nature, so that is something is of no interest to us. SOC 2 is your technical controls, and that is where we are interested. Now both SOC 1 and 2 can be of two types. Okay, one can be type 1 and the other one is type 2. Type 1 is a point in time report. What does point in time mean? Point in time is I went today for audit and my report is based on the observation made today itself. Okay, that is my point in time. What is type 2? Type 2 is based on the data gathered over a period of time, which is typically a year. Okay, so I've collected the data throughout the year and then figured out my report. So generally, what is of interest to us is SOC 2 type 2 reports. And then your SOC 3 is basically a sanitized version of SOC report, which is generally used for public circulation. So SOC 3 is for public, SOC 2 is your technical, and within that you have T1, type 1 and type 2. Type 2 is more detailed, have more data of a longer duration. Type 1 is your point in time. Okay. Now you're okay. So roles, again, as we have discussed during the data lifecycle, there'll be a life cycle of testing also. Okay, and if there is a life cycle to testing also, then there'll be some stakeholders. So the key stakeholders are generally your management. That is where your C-suite sits. Then there'll be an audit committee, which will be responsible for conducting audit form. Then you have your security officer, which will be involved in conducting audits. Then you'll have your compliance officer, then you'll have your internal and external auditors, which will actually perform the audit. Okay. So that is how the hierarchy is framed. You have your top management at top, then you have audit committee, which will give approvals or consents or put forth proposals to the management for consent. Then you have security officers, compliance officers, and internal and external auditors, which will actually perform the audit. So those are the typical roles involved in testing and auditing. Okay. Now what else do we have? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the audit process. So like anything that we have discussed so far, this too starts with setting the context of the organization. Okay, what do I mean by context? Is you determine your goal from whatever you want to achieve in the audit. For example, we want to test the efficacy of our AV, whether it is compliant with the policy document, which states that 99% of my endpoints should have the agent installed on them. Okay, so that can be one goal of audit. Okay, so that is my context of the organization. Once context is set, then I'll involve the right business leaders, because I have to obtain approval from the executive management, which sits on the top. Okay, so I involve the right business leaders in the second step. This is my first step, this is my second step. The third step is determine the scope. Since my policy document states that there will be 99% AV agent availability in all endpoints. So that sounds like a scope. Okay, I figured out my scope. Now I'll choose the audit team, whether I want internal people to do it, external people to do it, or a third party to do it. That is what we choose now. Okay, then I will plan the audit as to, on day one, we'll debrief the management as to this is our context, this is our goal, this is our context as in the goal, this is my scope and whatnot, and hence this is my day one activity. On day two, we'll check your AV reports. We'll fetch the AV reports from the center management console and see whether the compliance is there or not, what kind of a compliance is there. And then the last step is documenting my findings. So here I'll plan my audit. I'll give my plan and conduct the audit based on the plan. And after conducting the audit, I'll document my observations. So documentation is of utmost importance, and you can document things only when you have a structure in place. So first we figure out the goal that we want to achieve with audit. Then we choose the right people, then we obtain the right approvals, involve the top management. Then we choose the metrics on which we want to perform the audit. Then we choose the right people to audit it, internal, external, or third party. Then we plan our audit, then we conduct it, and then finally we find out the findings, which will be documented. Okay, so that is a typical process of auditing somebody. Now, talking about metrics, there can be two types of metrics, KPIs and KRIs. What KPI is, key performance indicator. What KRI is, key risk indicator. Okay, performance. Okay, where does it come from? I must have set a goal for myself. That becomes my KPI. For example, in the policy, I've said that 99% of endpoints should be AV agent installed. Now that becomes my key performance indicator. What KRI is, in future there'll be requirement of putting EDR in all the workstations, because AVs are definition based, signature based tools, which may not be able to detect or respond to the fileless threats, and hence EDR must be deployed in all the endpoints. That can be your key risk indicator. So KPI generally deal with what is already defined and established in past, and KRI generally deals with what is coming in future. Okay, so that is how you can remember KPI and KRI. Okay, now coming to VAPT. So what is VAPT? Domain 1, we talked about vulnerability. What is vulnerability? Vulnerability is something that exists in your environment already. Okay, so it is inherent. So in the beginning of the session, when we were talking about inherent risk, and then your risk appetite, then your risk treatment plan, kind of putting the inherent risks down to the limit of risk appetite of the organization. That is what a vulnerability is. A vulnerability is the inherent risk in doing any business. In your system, whatever inherent risk is there is your vulnerability. Okay. What is VAPT? It is vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. What is the difference between the two? Vulnerability is something which exists in the system, which basically means that it is already known. Okay. So there's anything which is unknown can be termed as 0 day. We'll talk about it in a bit. Okay. What is penetration testing? When vulnerability assessment is mostly passive. Okay. What is PT is? It is active first. You know, it generally comes after VA. It generally comes after VA. So once you have established that there are some vulnerabilities in your environment, and these are known. So there are exploit also known for these vulnerabilities. So when you actually exploit these vulnerabilities, and exploitation we have already discussed in domain 1, so you can go review that. So when we enumerate the vulnerabilities in the we exploit it, it becomes penetration. So that is your more active kind of a testing. Okay. What is a 0 day? A 0 day is basically which was not known so far, a vulnerability which was not known publicly, and hence it is a 0 day because it is known just today. It is the day 0 of it being out in the wild. Now, if you remember, Log4Shell was quite a headache for all of us. Log4Shell was a vulnerability. And why am I telling you this? Is because I want to tell you about CVE and CVSS. What is CVE? It is called Common Vulnerability Exposure Number. It is basically a reference number, basically an ID number. For example, you have your you have your employment number and whatnot, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or something. Similarly, CVEs are ID number of any vulnerability. So Log4Shell, what was the CVE number for this? Was CVE 2021 44228. Okay. What is CVSS? CVSS is your Common Vulnerability Scoring System. It is a scale from 0 to 10 which rates the severity of any vulnerability which is identified. Okay. And Log4Shell was having CVSS of 10, which is most critical. Okay. That is why it was a theme. And because it was an open component which was used in just too many applications because of the Log4j library being used in many applications. Okay, so that is CVE, your Common Vulnerability Exposure Number, which is an identification number, and your CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System, which gives a rating to the severity of the vulnerability on the scale of 1 to 10. Now coming to process of PT, I wanted to tell a little bit about it. What is the process of PT? Just give me a second. What is the process of PT? The process of PT is basically recon. First, recon is when you collect intel. You collect intel. That is basically you check DNS records, whatever data is publicly available. You check the DNS records, and what else is publicly available. You check the who is data, who the domain name is registered and whatnot. Okay, so that is a recon. Then you enumerate. Enumeration is basically an active thing when you actually start scanning for the vulnerabilities in the environment. So you do port scanning, stuff like that is where you're enumerating the vulnerabilities in the environment. Then you do the vulnerability assessment. So you figure out the vulnerabilities which are there. In enumeration, you basically figure out what ports and what services are running in your environment. And then in VA, you understand what are the known vulnerabilities related to those services or ports to which the environment is, the system is listening to. Then you do the actual execution, you launch the attack, and then you document it, then you report it. In case of vulnerability, you do not do the vulnerability analysis part. So you do not enumeration, you do not do that. Sorry, you do not do the execution phase. In VA, you do this, and document. In penetration, there's one more step where you execute, actually try to exploit the system. And that is what makes it an active exercise instead of a passive one. What is false positive and negative? And yeah, VA can be of two types. We can be either authenticated or unauthenticated. What authenticated means is you give the admin credentials to the scanning tool so that it gives you a clearer picture of what are the vulnerabilities which are there in the environment. And unauthenticated scan generally is meant for understanding how your system will look like, vulnerabilities in your system will look like to an attacker which is not having any credentials pertaining to that system. Okay, so it gives you that is what unauthenticated scan is generally used for, because your attacker may not be having the credentials pertaining, admin credentials at least pertaining to your environment. So it gives you a clearer idea as to what vulnerabilities will be visible to the attacker. Unauthenticated scan. Okay. What is false positive and negative? False positive is something which is not there in the environment and still it shows up in your vulnerability scans. Okay. That is false positive. False negative is something which is there in the environment, but it still does not show up in your vulnerability scan because of perhaps it may not be having the database or may not be having the fullest information pertaining to the environment that you may be having, or you may not have provided the right credentials for it to do a elevated scan in your environment. Okay. What is banner grabbing and fingerprinting? Banner grabbing is basically when somebody tries to understand, it is basically a part of your enumeration activity where an attacker tries to understand what version of what services are you using so that a vulnerability scan can be run more effectively. For example, if you're running a Apache web server, somebody will try to send a frame packet to receive an error or something. And in the error page, if it discloses the particular Apache web server that your service is running, then the VA scan can be targeted to that particular version of Apache web service. What fingerprinting is? Fingerprinting is trying to analyze the data on the wire to understand what kind of environment is underneath it. So running a proxy maybe to capture all the packets and then understand what kind of environment are you using in your systems. Then coming to logging and monitoring, you log all the activities in your environment, what are happening in your environment, just in case if something goes wrong or and if there is any unauthorized change in the environment, you can go back and check. That's why you do logging and monitoring. One key point to remember is optimizing the storage, because systems can generate huge logs, huge number of logs, huge amount of logs, which can overwhelm the onboard storage available on your devices. Hence, optimization of storage is required, which can be achieved either using a circular rewrite. What circular rewrite means is you fix the size of the log file, say 1 MB, and after the 10 MB is finished, it will start writing from the beginning. Okay, it is circular rewriting. or you can use clipping level or threshold level. For example, if I have in AV itself, if I have file reputation levels, say I have 5 levels, 1 to 5, I say that whenever there is a file which is having poorer reputation than 3, then only record such actions. So I'm limiting the kind of logs, the number of logs that the AV system is generating by reducing by telling the AV system to only record the activities pertaining to the files which are rated 3 and below. Okay, that is my clipping level or threshold that I've set. Now I can use a SIEM or SOAR. What is a SIEM? Security incident and event management is SIEM. Your SOAR is security orchestration, automation, and response. SOAR is basically an improvement on SIEM. What SIEM does is, your SIEM is typically made up of 3 components, which is a connector, a logger, and a enterprise management suite. And different product can call these things differently. What these basically are, it is the ingest pipeline. What does that basically mean is, here's your server. It may be generating, if it is a Windows server, it may be generating event logs. If it is a Linux server, it may be generating syslogs. Okay. What your ingest pipeline does is, it takes the log from here and it transforms. Okay. So if you have heard of transformation, or if you have heard of parsing, that is what your ingest pipeline does. Your connector is the ingest pipeline, and it transforms the data to make, say your syslog is in one of your firewalls is generating a syslog string like this. There's date, then there's space, then there's time, then there's space, then there is your website name, then there is space, IP address, space, IP, domain name, DNS server, whatever. Okay, this is the string that your firewall 1 is generating. Okay. Then your firewall 2 is generating it like this. Your data is here. Sorry, your date is here, your time is here. Then your IP is here, and your domain is here. Okay, and again your DNS is here. So what you see is, these are swapped in places between these 2 firewalls. So what your ingest pipeline will do is, transformation basically means that it will map these fields to the right columns. So when the data is ingested, it is basically presented in columns. So date is here, time is here, and domains may be here, IP may be here. So every time there is a domain, it will come in this column only. Every time there is an IP, it will come in this column only, irrespective of where it is located in the string. So that is what transformation does. Transformation, or your parsing. So it maps the data field in the syslog string to the right column. Then what your logger does is, your logger stores the data and normalizes it so that and indexes it so that the searching across the data is faster, across the logs is faster. Then what your EMS does is, your EMS does visualization. So you can do pie charts, you can do bar graphs, you can do all sorts of your what do we call this? That reporting and whatnot. You can define report templates and stuff like that here in EMS. And you can also write rules. Say if your AV is getting too many hits of lower than 3 rated files being executed on a specific endpoint. Say you have written a rule that your AV agent has collected incidences of 20 incidences of execution of files rated 3 or less in a particular endpoints. Then trigger a alert and raise a ticket pertaining to that, so that your SOC team can look into it. Your security operations center can look into it. Okay, so that kind of rules you can write on the EMS, Enterprise Management Suite. So whoever is interested in seeing SIEM in action, you can download ELK. ELK is an open source suite. ELK basically is Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana, sorry. Okay, so you download the ELF suite, which is available for free. You can see this SIM thing in action. What SOAR does is, SOAR on top of SIM, SOAR offers certain integrations. For example, say I've written a rule that if AV is generating logs pertaining to execution of files rated 3 or below 20 times in a row within 20 seconds from a single workstation, then what you do? You tell the NAC solution to throw the system, NAC is your network access control, throw this system out of network. Okay. So that kind of a action can be orchestrated using SOAR. And that is why SOAR is the next iteration of SOAR builds on top of your SIM solution, because it takes action and not just alerts and management and visualization. Okay. Then another important thing is using NTP and keeping the clocks in sync. For example, if my AV server is having 3 o'clock right now, and some date say 06/03/2022, that is the date, and 3 o'clock is there in the time. But at the branch where there is a VSAT connection, there is a lag, and it is the date is incorrect over there, say 3/3/2022, and the time is also different, say 15:30. So whenever you try to correlate the logs between the two, even if the incident occurs on the machines, on both the machines at the same time, due to the change in date and time, you won't be able to map it correctly. So that is why we use NTP, which is network time protocol, which gives a single time to all these machines which are synced with NTP. And generally your AD server, Active Directory server in Windows-based environment, serves as a NTP also. So it becomes your AD server becomes a NTP server also. In the environments, in the Windows environments where there is AD is implemented, Active Directory, Microsoft Active Directory is implemented. Okay. Then analysis and retention basically depends on analysis. I've already told you, you can write rules based on which certain triggers will be happening. And retention is basically whatever period of time you need to retain the logs due to your legal requirements or whatever regulatory requirements or legal requirements. Okay. So that is all from my side in this session, in the security assessment and testing session. Now we'll move on to the questions pertaining to this domain. And again, we'll do the same thing. We'll have 10 seconds to answer your questions. So the first question is here. Which of the following types of vulnerability cannot be discovered in the course of a routine vulnerability assessment? Your time starts now. Cool, your time ends now. Time's up. And everybody has gotten it right. So I guess everybody was paying attention to it. Option A is correct. Moving on to the second question. Ben's team is attempting to categorize a transaction identification issue that is caused by use of symmetric key shared by multiple servers. What stride category should this fall into? Time starts now. And your time is up. Nobody has responded. So let me tell you guys. Yeah, there you are correct. Naresh, you're not. So let's discuss this question. So for a moment, let's set stride aside. Let's forget about stride. Okay. Now let me tell you how this question sounds. Ben's team is attempting to categorize a transaction identification issue that is caused by a symmetric key shared by multiple servers. So your multiple servers are using a single shared key. What they can do is, since you must be knowing that in symmetric key encryption, you shall use unique key pairs between the two, client and server. Hence, repudiation is happening here. Denial of service is something when your availability is lost. Information disclosure is where your confidentiality is lost. Tampering is where your integrity is lost. So you're still encrypting it, So confidentiality is not lost. It is not a question of denial of service. It is a question of repudiation, because anybody can say that, okay, I didn't initiate this communication. Maybe the server, if it was initiated by server one, maybe server one can say that, okay, I did initiate that. Server two has initiated it, and you have no way to figure out whether the server one, two, or three has initiated it, because all three are using the same key to encrypt the data. So non-repudiation is there. Diana has engaged third-party auditors and wants to release an audit attestation to third parties without including details of the audit. What type of SSAE 18 SOC report should she request? The time starts now. And time's up. So in your CISSP test, you'll often come across these kind of redundant words. You don't need to focus on that. Just focus on the key core fundamentals. And that is, I do not wish to include details. And what is the most sanitized report of all the SOC reports? Is SOC 3, hence your option C is correct. Coming to fourth question, Fred has been contracted as a penetration tester. He will have access to the internal lines of code and general design of an application that needs to be tested. Fred always has had malicious intent. Howard is testing the same software without any prior knowledge. He will approach his duty as if he thinking like a malicious attacker. Howard is a security professional. Robin is an ethical hacker who has been tasked to cover the vulnerabilities missed by Fred and Howard. She has been given some information about system, but not everything. Gary is performing SQL injection in the test environment. He has created a database and is now testing it for vulnerabilities. Gary is a programmer who can do the most damage. Your time starts now. Okay, your time's up. Yeah, Fred, because Fred knows everything. So what is happening here is there can be three cases: white, gray, and black box. Black box is when the person who is carrying out VAPT is not knowing anything about the code. Gray is when you have some idea. White is when you have all the information required. So Fred is having internal lines of code and general design of the application. Okay. So this sounds like a white box. Howard is testing some software without prior knowledge. This sounds like a black box. And Scary has been tasked with she has been given some information. So some information. So Robin is sounding like a gray box. Moving on to the next question. A security consultant has been urgently hired by bank to discover any unknown and exploitable weaknesses within the business. As it was long holiday weekend, half of the workforce as well as senior management were not available. The consultant decided to take proactive measures and begin her activities. The consultant first gathered preliminary intelligence on the target through various automated scanning tools. She then gained access to one of the internal networks by tunneling traffic through remote VPN. After exploiting several other vulnerabilities within the organization's servers and databases, the consultant managed to freely traverse multiple areas of the environment, gathering the maximum amount of data possible. Once enough information was collected, she removed all traces of her presence in the breached network. On the following business day, she encrypted the results of her security test and sent the password protected report to the bank's senior management. Which of the following was conducted by the security consultant?